My name is Whitney Donhauser, and I'm the Roné Menschel Director here. And we're so excited to present the first event in our new series of programs, New York's Future in a Changing Climate, which explores the challenges and opportunities presented in the museum's Future City Lab is our third interactive gallery of our permanent exhibition, New York at its Core, which is 400 years of New York City's history. So the first two galleries, for those who have not seen this permanent exhibition, the first two galleries of New York at its Core capture, through 450 objects and computer interactives, the human energy that drove New York to become the city that it is today. The third gallery, the Future City Lab, turns its attention to explore 5 challenges and opportunities that New York will face in coming generations. So the first 4 of those challenges ask our visitors to look at the future of our economy, housing, transportation, and how to coexist with other citizens. The 5th challenge of the lab, however, living with nature, ask how citizens of this enormous, complex city of ours, with our huge appetites, are going to maintain a balance with nature and our surroundings, natural ecosystems, and how we're going to depend on so much from food, water, health, protection from extreme weather, green space, recreation, and beauty. So this has always been a very, very delicate balance to achieve, and only grows more and more critical as our climate grows warmer. So I would love to thank our series sponsor, Saville Studley, and particularly our trustee, Mitch Steers, who has provided so much support for today's program and for the entire events related to this series. And this afternoon, we are thrilled to have 8 amazing speakers join us for 2 wide-ranging conversations examining how New York City can survive and embrace its future in the changing climate and rising waters. After the conversations that we have, we'll invite everyone upstairs to a reception. This is at the end, after the 2 series, for wine and light refreshments in our rotunda, where the director of the Future City Lab, Kubi Ackerman, will introduce the lab, and the museum scholars will have them stationed throughout the whole lab to answer any questions that you might have. So it's also a great honor for me to acknowledge the series partners, and we've partnered with numerous organizations, including the nonprofit communications group Climate Nexus, the Tishman Environment and Design Center, and Urban Systems Lab, which are both at the New School. And we're grateful for this opportunity to work with them and really benefit from their input into this series. So please check your printed programs for a complete list of all of our affiliates, and we thank all these organizations for their support. So I'd also like to encourage any of you who are not museum members to join us today. Which membership here helps us support our exhibitions, our public programming, and our educational outreach to the schools. So if you join today, we will give you a membership for 15 months rather than a normal 12 months. And there's so much fun activities that we do here. And as a member, you get free admission, reduced rates on programs, discount in our sales shop, in our cafe, and any of the sales associates in our shop can help you with a membership. So this is a moment where I ask you to turn off anything that buzzes or beeps, except for those of you who like to tweet. We encourage that using the hashtag MCNYLive. And now, please join me in welcoming the director of the Future City Lab, Kubi Ackerman. So thank you.
Thank you, Whitney, and welcome again to the museum. It's very exciting to be here on this for this inaugural event in this series. As Whitney mentioned, we're going to have 2 conversations today, separated by a 15-minute intermission, during which time we'll have coffee and tea in the back of the room here. I'd also like you to encourage you to check out our museum shops. On the first floor, we have some books available by some of our distinguished panelists today for sale. So this series is inspired by the Future City Lab, which is the 3rd gallery in our New York at its Core exhibition, which, as Whitney mentioned, covers the big challenges that the city's facing in the coming generations. And it could be argued that none of these challenges is as big and as daunting as that of climate change, which threatens it poses an existential threat not only to New York, but to our society as we know it. And for that reason, we felt an obligation not only to cover it and address it in the gallery, but to organize our entire first series around this issue. And in so doing, we were prompted to ask ourselves, what is the role of a museum, and what is the role specifically of a history museum in addressing urgent contemporary concerns? And because we're not the only institution in this city, obviously, to address these issues. And part of the role of the History Museum is to tie the events of the past to those of the present, to forge narratives that help us understand the present and where we're going in the context of what came before. And by that measure, it could be argued that climate change poses an unusual challenge. For while we've always had to grapple with our relationship to our natural environment, in many ways, climate change resists historical narrative, in that our ability to so radically alter our environment on a global scale so as to threaten its very ability to support civilization is in many ways without historical precedent. And that's part of what makes it so difficult to face. But I would argue that that's not the full picture, because as many of our panelists today have written about in their work, in many ways we're seeing familiar historical and behavioral patterns at play in our response, or lack thereof, to the crisis. And in order to effectively respond, we may need to recall historical and perhaps even pre-modern ways of understanding and inhabiting our world. For as our panelist Amitav Ghosh writes in his book, The Great Derangement, an awareness of the precariousness of human existence is to be found in every culture. And he goes on to write that it was in the literary imagination, most of all, that was everywhere informed by that awareness. And that brings me to my second point as to why we're hosting this symposium, which is that as a cultural institution, part of our role can be to provide a voice and to offer perspectives that are not always at the forefront of climate discussions, which often tend to be oriented towards more technocratic solutions. And for while our continually evolving state of the science and potential policy remedies are central to our ability to be able to react to the crisis, it's become painfully clear that the increasingly dire warnings of climate scientists are not having the impact we would hope or expect, and that there are much larger political, cultural, social, and behavioral forces at play which transcend, in many ways, rational consideration. And that's why we feel that the role of cultural institutions is so important in addressing this crisis. And finally, I'd like to say that in our role as the Museum of the City of New York, our aim in the series is to focus on a specific place, which is our city. Because as much as this is a global problem, its effects and its impacts are distributed very unevenly, both locally and globally. And effective response must ultimately be grounded in local place-based knowledge and incorporate the needs of specific communities. And that's why we have a focus, especially in the second panel, on what New York's communities can and are doing to address this crisis. So with that, I'd like to welcome you again, and I would like to welcome our first panel.
I'm Andy Revkin. Oh, there we go. I've been writing about this weird issue now since 1985. How long is that? It's long enough. But I just rejoined the fray. I was in academia for 6 years after 20 years at the Times. I was at Pace University for a while, writing my blog at the Times, and then but now I'm back at ProPublica, back in doing full-time climate journalism again, finishing a pretty complicated story right now that's got my wife even more agitated than me because of the vibes I put out. Everyone on this panel is has a special appropriateness for today's conversation, the one we're doing, which is about this idea of confronting the unthinkable, because that implicitly involves not just the physical environment, but our reactions to it, or our lack of reactions to it. I'll introduce them in a second. But I want to introduce the basic concepts I think that we'll be talking about. One, the word confront is an interesting word. To me, it implies resistance. Confront means to resist. So I would add, I think one of the first things we'll talk about probably is how much of this needs to be confronted. Where do you draw the line between confrontation and embracing change? Whether you call it embracing, accepting, there are aspects of this problem that are underway that can't be stopped. New York City will be a city with rising waters for centuries to come. And I wrote critically when Mayor Bloomberg last spoke about this as mayor in 2013. His speech to me felt like climate denial, because he basically said, we will not retreat. And any scientist who understands the basics of how climate change happens knows you can't just do that, unless we go into the realm of geoengineering, which there's a big movie out now about. So there's a lot of denial around in different ways. There's a lot of different senses of, again, where do you draw the line? To me, I wrote a reflection on this several years ago for a couple of magazines where it feels a little bit like mortality. You know, we're all going to die. Even saying those words is kind of a bummer. But how do you deal with that? What do you confront in terms of shaping your life in a better way, and what do you accept, and when do you accept it? And so there's aspects of this problem that have that scale to them. But we'll get into that in a big way going forward. It's great to see a museum involved. One of the things that thrilled me a few years ago was when the Wildlife Conservation Society did the Mannahatta exhibit. Some of you probably saw that, or the book. That took us back in time 500 years ago to when Manhattan, where we're all sitting, was an ecological system that had no relationship to what we look at now. And the challenge of this conference, this meeting today, is going forward in time. What do you do? What can you do based on what we understand about the history of cities and how they change or don't change to make New York City that can thrive in a world with no new normal coastline and that kind of thing. And that exhibit, I thought, was a great way to sort of frame, to remind us that change is normal. Change right now is, in all of our systems, seems unthinkable. So let's start right in. I just want to introduce, I don't really have to introduce anyone here, hopefully. I'll start at the far end. Elke Weber, who was at Columbia University for a long time. She created I love the name of CRED. This was the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions. And she's just recently, just a year or so, moved to Princeton. And her background's in psychology and in studying social systems. And she's been an invaluable source of mine for a long time on the sort of softer side of how we confront these issues. And in the middle is Amitav Ghosh, who Calcutta-born, has been everywhere in the world, as far as I can tell, and written creatively in both fiction and nonfiction about everything you can imagine. And won wonderful awards. His most recent book, which I think has this fantastic, it's a nonfiction book about the lack of fiction around this issue and that imagination around the issue of climate change. I'll ask him about what was the key question: Are we deranged? I guess that's the great derangement was the main title of his new book. Naomi Oreskes, who I've known for a long time, is right here. She's a historian of science and a geologist by background. She's written forcefully on the attempts to exploit human behavioral trends, tendencies. The book Merchants of Doubt she was co-author of, which is a must-read on how manipulable we can be, and that people have spent lots of resources making sure that our tendency toward inertia is sustained. There was a film also called Merchants of Doubt. Was it based on the book, right? And she is. I guess it had to be.
Only Frontline does.
Yeah. And she's also a member of the Anthropocene Working Group, which is this. I was on this for 6 years. It's a group of people sitting, mostly scientists, some others, assessing whether the world is now ours, literally in a scientific way, ours. We've appropriated the planet essentially, and I'd love to catch up on how that's going. So we'll start at the far end, I think, with Elke. Again, to me, the title of this was unthinkable, but maybe unbelievable is better. Could you talk about beliefs versus thought, but when you think about how people think or react to this climate change problem or don't, what are the things that come to mind? Is why don't they get this, or wouldn't it be great if?
I think climate change, in many ways, is a perfect storm for the kind of issues that I study. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, so I look at how the human mind and the human brain processes information. And then also with my colleagues, I look at motivation. What motivates us to do things? What motivates us to change, given that most of the time we don't like change? And I've looked at other issues, whether it's insufficient pension savings, our eating habits, and we like to stay healthy, but we also like to have our cake and eat it too. And I think sort of all of these issues sort of dwarf in comparison to climate change because it has all the same recipe. Action requires costs, inconvenience upfront, for sure, now. And the benefits come down the road, they come in dribbles, they come with high uncertainty. At least for pension savings and for eating, it's our future selves we're benefiting. In the case of climate change, it's future generations, people in faraway places. So all the things that make it difficult, sort of enforce and more collective action issues. And so to some extent, it's a miracle that we do anything in that space. Maybe just add one other thing is the closest, we talked about denial and climate change deniers. I think we all are climate change deniers at some point in time. Come Friday afternoon, we don't want to think about that issue. And the closest I can come to finding a good analogy to how we react to climate change is how we deal with death. I mean, we all know at some level we're going to die. It's going to happen, but it's a very cerebral kind of knowledge. It's a statistical fact, and deep down we don't really believe it's going to happen to us. And it's also something that's very, very unpleasant to think about, and it's a huge problem, and there are no plausible, feasible solutions to that. And so it makes sense to just put it out of your mind, switch channels, and think about it when you have to. And I think sort of that we also see in the space of climate change. And then the question is, what do we do about it? Do we have to, if there is an information deficit, for most of us, it's no longer that this is a problem we have to deal with. It's what can we do about it, individually and collectively, and can we communicate that there are solutions? Because I think it's the absence of seeing that this is something that's solvable in principle that also causes us to turn away. Aside from all the, so the voluntary and ill-intentioned, malevolent denials, but I think sort of at some level we all deny this really important phenomenon.
Great. So for those who have not read your book, the most recent one, what is that crying, how would you encapsulate that crying question you explore?
As a writer of fiction, really what interests me is the strange place of climate change within our imagination and the ways in which climate change really resists our imagination and even our ways of thinking about the world. I mean, since I've been in New York, there have been two really important events in the city. One was 9/11 and one was Hurricane Sandy, And if you think of the ways in which 9/11 is remembered, I mean, how much it's memorialized, I mean, really, it never escapes our memory for 1 minute. And if you think of Hurricane Sandy, I mean, most of us don't even remember the date, And there's no such thing as any kind of a memorial to it. Really, as far as I know, this is the only event that's happening around Hurricane Sandy. And yet, Hurricane Sandy had such a profound and powerful effect upon this city. And if you consider that, New York has a greater concentration of writers, artists, filmmakers than virtually any place in the world. And yet, can you think of a single novel or film in which Hurricane Sandy figures? I mean, they're completely absent. And as for asking the question of, are there any paintings or is there any sculpture, any art in which Hurricane Sandy figures, we can't even ask that because it sounds absurd. Because we live in a space where art is so completely disjoined from our circumstances that it seems almost, to merely ask that question is to suggest something illustrative, which has become so pejorative in the world of the arts. So, it's these things that really interest me. What are the ways in which climate change as a phenomenon really resists even the imagination of the arts and literature? So, politicians and bureaucrats and so on are one level of people who do need to respond to this. But I do feel that, the fact that climate change and events of this kind figure so little in our imagination really prepares the ground for denial, if you like.
How much of that do you think is about the gatekeepers for the arts? meaning publishers saying, well, these books on climate change don't sell because people don't want to think about this, or a gallery would think, well, that's just activist art, or is that part of this too? I'm just throwing that out.
Yes, I think that must be certainly a part of it, in that, editors and so on, their literary tastes, their artistic inclinations were also, how shall I say, honed and shaped by a time of climatic stability. So they too are not able to respond. So in that sense, it's a circular thing. I mean, whether it's the chicken or the egg, we don't know. But it's also curious if you look at it that there are several novels about New York or a city like New York drowning in the near future. There are many novels like that, and yet there's not a single novel about the actual drowning of New York.
Yeah.
So, what is this strange disjunction?
Well, that's a good prod. I hope people are, taking heed of it, because there are these great stories to tell. They're mostly granular stories to tell too, about what it must have been like for old people in downtown towers with no elevators, all that stuff, or the way communities, Wall Street, what was it called? The Occupy Wall Street became Occupy Sandy. Sort of a creative transformation of an existing architecture for social action to something else. There's plenty of fodder.
There's plenty of material, and let me say, this is not just New York. Mumbai in India has been through 2 or 3 such events in these last 10 years. Mumbai again has a huge concentration of artists, writers, filmmakers, and so on. Again, not a single a book or novel or film or artwork about these terrible events that have happened. So, it's not a local phenomenon. Yeah. It's something much, much wider.
There's one other aspect of this. I'll probably bounce to you in a minute, but we'll go to Naomi next. But it's the George Marshall, who wrote that interesting book about the mind and climate. Several years ago, when I was still writing .Earth for the Times, he had gone to area outside of Austin, Texas, where they'd had terrible fires, some part of which the climate conditions were likely intensified by global warming. But he interviewed a bunch of people who had been through that, and he found that essentially the experience of the disaster made people more of who they already are. If you're a survivalist, libertarian, go it aloner, it made you more feel that you needed that. If you're a group hugger, communitarian, it made you feel more the sense of having to help other people. And that, I don't know whether that's part of that even when we have a disaster, we're not experiencing the same story. But that's a story, too, to tell as well.
And George Marshall also went to New Jersey, after Hurricane Sandy. And he found that when he tried to talk to people about climate change, they got extremely upset. They didn't want to hear about it, didn't want to talk about it.
So we'll swing to you on that, too. But Naomi, let's talk about that line between confrontation and embracing, or whatever. It's also the context between adaptation and mitigation. And you would think we're grown up enough, at least at some level, human society, to do more than one thing at the same time. But for a very long time, the idea of needing to adapt, needing to build a city that can thrive with climate change, even as you cut emissions contributing to it, it seems even the left would resist that sometimes. So just stepping back, what's the thing that drives you crazy about this context of the climate problem? There's so many.
Well, nothing about this really drives me crazy. When I became a historian after having been a scientist for many years, my husband said, well, the great thing about historians, when we started hanging out with them, he goes, they can hold 2 ideas in their head at the same time. Some even 3. So none of this exactly drives me crazy. That's not really what I experienced. I would say right now, the last few weeks, the last couple of months, especially the fires in California, which are very personal for me because I've lived most of my adult life in California, I feel a tremendous sense of sadness. And I feel a very profound sense that actually this could have been avoided, not easily, but that there are solutions to, substantial solutions to at least going a long way to addressing the problem. And one of the reasons we haven't done that is because it's part of climate disinformation to say that there's no solution, to say that we can't change it, there's nothing we can do about it. And so I guess if something makes me angry, it's that. It's the kind of disempowering rhetoric that says, you know, in a way what you said, that it's like death. Well, yeah, I mean, on one level I totally agree with you. In some sense it is like death because a very substantial amount of climate change is now locked in. I don't use the word committed. Scientists always say we're committed to climate change. And years ago, my 15-year-old daughter said, "Mom, only men think that commitment is a bad thing, right? You know." So we're locked in. That's a better metaphor. So in that sense, you're right. That part of it's unavoidable. But on the other hand, there's a lot that we can do. And so the rhetoric of it, you know, being inevitable, unavoidable, is part of denial and disinformation. And since we know that that's been kind of a prong in the disinformation story, you know, one thing that I think is really important is to talk about the solutions, whatever those are, whether you think of them in terms of mitigation or adaptation. And I guess that was one reason why I was happy to come here today, because one of the points of light, one of the good news stories in this otherwise rather sad story, is cities, for two reasons. One is because the majority of people in the world now live in cities, and that trend will almost certainly increase in the future. If you look at demographic projections, we see a lot of evidence that big cities are going to get even bigger. And that's actually a good thing. Some people think that's bad. They think, oh my God, there'll be X million people in Mexico City or whatever it is, or Sao Paulo. But actually it's a tremendous opportunity, because cities actually tend to be more energy efficient than suburbs and the country, and because the potential for energy efficiency in concentrated urban areas like New York or Sao Paulo or Mumbai are very, very great. And in fact, they often correlate, or at least align, with things that make life in those cities better anyway, like a city that's more walkable. They often align with better health, like a city that has less air pollution. So there really is a good news story to be told about what cities can do, what opportunities there are in cities. And also, it's the case, particularly in the United States, but not only in America, cities tend to be more progressive. People who live in cities tend to be more willing to try new things, to be more innovative. I mean, this is a gross generalization, but there's evidence to support it. So that means that places like New York, or Boston, or Los Angeles, or Chicago, or San Francisco, or even Austin, and even actually Dallas, which, contrary to what a lot of people think, is actually a majority Democratic city, but because it's gerrymandered, you wouldn't know that. You know, you have these pockets of people who are, what's the opposite of change averse? Change welcoming, risk welcoming, creative, innovative, and often politically progressive. So I think there are tremendous opportunities in American cities, and I think we're seeing similar patterns in other places around the world. So that's the place that I get happy, because I think there's real opportunities, and some of the things that need to be done could be done, you know, reasonably briskly, let's say within 10 to 20 years.
Elke, the other thing about cities is, well, about resilience in cities that I've learned in reporting on these questions for a long time, is that not all, we think about infrastructure as hard things, buildings and white roofs or green roofs or storm barriers, but there's this social infrastructure that can play a big role in cities, behavioral infrastructure that can play a big role in cities being resilient. The Chicago heat wave, I always think back to the book Eric Kleinenberg did, 1995 analysis of that showed that neighborhoods that had more cohesion, this is before Twitter and social networks, neighborhoods that had strong church groups, they had a lot fewer old people died, because everyone said, oh yeah, Elsa, she's on the floor in that building. They knew that, and that's kind of part of cities' resilience. What other parts of resilience can come from within, as opposed to just building stuff?
So one thing that psychologists study is, you know, how can we change the environment, you know, not just the physical environment, but the choice environment, in ways that make the outcome of our decisions, you know, more beneficial to ourselves and to others. And we call this choice architecture. And one thing to think about is, you know, what's different about living in a city than living in a rural community? And I think one thing that's different about living in a city is you're constantly surrounded by other people, and just the mere presence of other people, and oftentimes people that you care about, you know, just reminds you of the fact that your actions impact others. You know? And this gets to the fact that we have like a whole bunch of motivations, you know, sort of, you know, stored up, oftentimes contradictory motivations. Very few of us actually want to destroy planet Earth, you know, but we have other motivations that get in the way of sort of making sure we don't destroy planet Earth. And it turns out that it's a motivation that's active, at the time of decision that guides your decisions. And so some recipe to actually motivating change and motivating more foresightful thinking and action is to help people to have these motivations that have to do with the future, having to do with cooperation, having to do with sort of caring for the environment, to be more salient in their minds at the time of decision. And I think that's why people in cities look like they're probably more progressive, because they're just more reminded of the fact that sort of cooperation actually is a good thing, and that not looking out for others actually is a bad thing. So I think that's sort of like a maybe too long answer to your question.
No, not at all. I wrote down choice, the architecture of choice.
Can I add something about the
course.
fiction question? Because I have had a few thoughts on that, and we've talked about this. I think one of the reasons why there hasn't been more creative response to these stories is climate change got framed early on as a science question. You and I have talked about this too. And in some ways that we understand why that was. It was because it was scientists who first recognized that when you burn fossil fuels, you create greenhouse gases, they accumulate in the atmosphere. Sooner or later, that has to warm the planet. So it was scientists who were the first people who began to talk about this as an issue in the 50s and 60s. And once it gets framed as a scientific question, then the only writers who can write about it are science fiction writers. And actually some have, right? Like Kim Stanley Robinson has made this a major theme in his work. But as you know better than I do, editors dismiss that as genre fiction, right? So, and when we wrote our book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, my agent said to me, do not call this science fiction. And I said, okay, what should I call it? She goes, just say you wrote a book. I'm like, okay, I'm happy with that.
Can you actually give them a thumbnail about what it is?
So it's,
Yeah.
I
It's
guess
pretty
you could call it
interesting.
speculative fiction. It's a work of fiction in which the narrator, there's really only one character. It's the narrator, who is a historian 300 years in the future, looking back on our present, on us, and saying, how is it possible that they knew so much about this problem, had such sophisticated science, and yet failed to act? And then she tells the story of what happened as the consequence of our failure to act.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful book, so if you haven't read it, you must.
It's very short,
This is
too.
wonderful too, and it's short. Yeah. 'Cause it doesn't take long for the world to end.
I agree with you, Naomi. I think the whole issue of it having been, that scientists were, as it were, the diagnosers of this whole problem has really resulted in it being thought of in a particular way. But as far as I'm concerned, I think it's fundamentally a cultural problem. The whole issue of climate change is ultimately driven by culture, and most of all, it's driven by a culture of desires. And that's where I think I would disagree with you about the whole thing about cities, because I think you're describing really first world cities and American cities. But, the major drivers of climate change today aren't in the first world. They're really in Asia. And if you look at the way that this plays out within the Asian context, when an Asian peasant abandons his land and moves to a city, he is really becoming acculturated into a culture of desire. So his consumption pattern changes completely, his energy, his emissions patterns change completely. I don't know that there have been any studies about this, but I'm absolutely sure that an Asian, a Chinese or Indian farmer, when they're in their village, emit much, much less than they do once they move to the city. So, I think, in fact, this whole process of urbanization is actually one of the things that's driving climate change in a very significant way, not only because of all the people who are moving to cities and adopting a new form of consumption, but also because really, we talk about climate change being driven by carbon emissions. But really, I think right now, the major driver is construction, the construction industry. Anywhere you go in the world, but most of all in Asia, everywhere you look, enormous buildings are arising all around us. And cement is really one of the most carbon-heavy forms of industry. And what is behind it? Ultimately, it's the real estate industries. And the real estate industries have literally taken over the world. I don't think it's any accident that the President of America today is a real estate person. I think you're going to see this again and again. Because I can tell you, I spend half my time in a small village in India. And I see now, completely pointless projects. As long as there's cement involved, they come up overnight.
Yeah.
This whole spree of dam building, what's behind it? It's the cement industries. And so I agree with you. I think actually in the real world, scientifically speaking, it might be possible to stop this. But in the social world, I don't think there's anybody in the world who can take on the construction industries.
These are really interesting questions. I'll give you a little sliver of what I've been working on the last few months. I was in rural India, east of Mumbai a few months ago. I'm doing a big story about cooking and pollution and efforts to fix the problem, and everyone there too has a different solution, a narrative. The West came in with stoves, presuming that an Indian woman who has to harvest firewood for a couple hours a day would prefer to work with this device that's simplistic and isn't tuned to her lifestyle or her goals at the moment anyway. And what I hear about, one of the things I hear about is, and this relates to is it the real estate industry or is it, they call it suppressed demand. In other words, when people who are having to spend 4 hours a day just cooking, that's just cooking time, and then another couple of hours a day getting the fuel to cook or paying precious money, to them, LPG, a fossil fuel, is just a gift. And that is the aspirational fuel. And anywhere in India, actually in parts of Africa too, everyone looks to that as the solution. And in the end, it can have a lower carbon footprint than some of these other things. But there is this question of how much of this is internal and our need for energy, how much of it is this sort of the merchants of, whether you want to call it merchants of consumption, that's...
But they go together, right?
Yeah,
The
so how
reason
much of
why
it, again...
driving consumption works in part is because people do like to consume, but there's also different ways to think about consumption.
Yeah.
But can I ask...
Of course, yeah. Everyone here should feel free to...
So what you say is very important and provocative, but it raises this big question. It seems like you're suggesting that we would be better off if many of these rural villagers could stay in rural areas rather than moving to cities. But, I mean, is that what you're suggesting? And if so, is that plausible?
I'm suggesting, in the first place, that the movement to cities, that the greater urbanization, and most of this is in Asia, really, does not by any means represent the hopeful trend that you're suggesting or gesturing at. For another reason, which is that the city is actually, once people enter the city, they enter also middle-class patterns of thought. So it's actually the city, it's the middle classes in India that are incredibly resistant to climate change mitigation. I mean, violently resistant, you might say almost. Yeah. Whereas people who are in the countryside, who are exposed to these realities, understand it much better. What they're facing. So should I say that more people should remain in the countryside? Today, that's not something anybody can say. Why? Because then I'm saying that poverty is better. But I could say then also, what is the criteria? I think this is where we've gone so profoundly wrong. Yeah. What is our judgment of what poverty is? When Aristotle lived, presumably somebody went and fetched firewood for him. Was Aristotle a poor person? I mean, were our grandparents poor because they didn't have washing machines? But yet now this pattern of desire is in place. And to even consider disrupting it is to run up against a sort of agreed global definition of what is wealth and what is poverty.
Okay, I wanted to get at the timescale issue, which is something that Kim Stanley Robinson's books and others, when you smear us out over longer timescales, or like the Mannahatta exhibit I was talking about, we have a really hard time making decisions on those timescales, even when with climate change, those are the decisions. How much do we mitigate now for the sake of climate stability in 2100 or beyond? And I don't know whether you've studied that in the sense of choice architecture, or was there any way to get around that? Pierre Humbert, I interviewed him a couple of years ago in this, and they did a really good paper where they said, let me see if I can encapsulate this. The title of this paper was Multimillennial Consequences for Sea Level and Climate of 21st Century Decisions. That's basically their paper, and they had this great diagram showing you that sea level for the next 5,000 years is ours to make. So how does that work? Is there any way to fix that, or is it even appropriate to ask that question?
Well, I think it's undeniable that we have a problem with this, not just sort of the general public, but also scientists. The fact that all our projections end at 2100, and there's nothing magical about 2100, but it's just a convenient cutoff. And for most of us, when we think about sort of putting weight on future consequences, there's something called the present bias. If I can't have it now, I care about it much, much, much less. And then we only very little differentiate between things that are a little bit in the future or very much in the future and so on. So I think the question is, again, how to focus people on the future, given that this is not something we do naturally. And this is probably part of our evolutionary heritage. Our problems used to be simpler. It used to be important that you survive till tomorrow. You didn't go to the drinking hole when the lion was there, because if you don't survive till tomorrow, then you don't have to worry about the day after. We no longer have that kind of latitude. We live in a complex society where we have to think more about the future. And so given that we don't do it naturally, we naturally focus our finite attention on ourselves, on the here and now. Are there ways that we can sort of use? I think legacy motivation is one of the things that has been quite successful, sort of getting away from us, but thinking about what we leave behind, or future generations, our own children or other people. Getting people to focus first on the future rather than focusing first on the present is one way of doing that. And I think Bloomberg's Risky Business report did this very nicely. He reframed the issue as one of what what the status quo is inaction, and anything that we change is going to have a cost. He said, well, let's focus on the cost of action, cost of inaction, and compare those two. And so he basically sort of focused on the future with our status quo first, and having us imagine that. So I think some of it has to do with the sequence in which we do things, and we tend to start with the here and now, and then we go into the future. And I think that's also where fiction, or the arts can help us. We have this amazing sort of anchor on the here and now, and so change is very incremental. Oftentimes, change is not transformative. We think about small wrinkles that we can change. I think Ford at some point said if he had asked people when he invented the automobile what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And in hindsight, maybe faster horses wouldn't have been such a bad idea. And so one challenge we all have is, how do we sort of get out of us being stuck on what we have, whether it's our current economy, the carbon economy, whether it's sort of our current way of living, our current conception of happiness being tied to consumption. I think once we change what's meant by happiness, and make it more communitarian, and getting away from these sort of transaction and consumption metrics, I think a lot of other things will follow. But how do we do that? It's not so easy.
We're going to go to your questions in a few minutes, but I've got a couple more, and hopefully everyone here will have one or two to ask each other as well. You talk about this sort of status quo bias, which is clearly there, the bias toward the present. One thing I've wondered about off and on is, like with this movie, Geostorm, or whatever it is, which I haven't seen yet, or Day After Tomorrow, we also seem to have a catastrophe bias, at least in our imagination. We're attracted way more to catastrophic futures, dystopian, than to stories that work out. And they're boring, and they're too much like the present. There's this place outside of Vienna called IIASA, I-I-A-S-A. It's a long name. They study complex systems. And I spent a week there a couple of years ago, and they've done a lot of modeling of the human adventure, but going forward over the next 3 or 4 centuries. And they put in scenarios. They have, fertility rates, population. I'm sure someone will ask about that population issue. And they have scenarios that get us to kind of this quiet planet in 2300. This is just a scenario. No one knows whether you can actually make it happen, where there is no catastrophe between now and 2300, and we end up with a population of about 1 or 2 billion prosperous people. So that's in the system. It's there. You can draw those lines, but and how does that work? It's like a tiny tweak in fertility rates. And if it's the wrong tweak, then you end up with a depopulated planet where you need way too many robots. But so I don't know. Are we missing scenarios? Are we not? And this would include the fiction world. I know Kim Stanley Robinson actually writes books that are sort of non-calamitous sometimes. But is that just not read because it's not as exciting as when the hunter comes back from the hunt, with some scary story to tell? I don't know. How does that? Maybe Amitav, do you?
I mean, I've always thought part of the problem with climate change is that it isn't actually a catastrophe. It's more like the death of 1,000 cuts. There are so many little different ways in which this is playing out. And in the past, it was always the case that deniers and doubters would accuse scientists of being alarmists and catastrophists. But the reality is, when you think about it, so many things we're facing are just a lot of small things that add up in bad ways. Or even if you think about sea level rise, right? I mean, it's really just a very tiny amount of sea level rise in any given year.
Right.
But over time, that adds up in ways that can be very, very consequential. And the other thing that's weird about it, and this feeds into your thing about imagination. But now we're in a situation, so that's what I used to say 10 years ago, that I thought the reason why it was hard to get people's attention for climate change is because it wasn't a single catastrophe, it was a death of 1,000 cuts. But now, here we are, fast forward to Harvey, fast forward to Maria, fast forward to the Napa and Sonoma fires, and now we really are seeing catastrophes and crises. And even with that, it seems that there's a failure of an imagination that doesn't enable us to quite put it all together somehow. So I don't know what to make of that.
I think it's interesting what Andy said, that we are drawn to this catastrophic idea of a future or something, and actually, climate change is exactly as you said. It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's horrible, ugly things. I mean, like in Harvey. What is that spills out? It's everything we don't want to think about, like sewerage and drainage and waste and pollution, ugly, horrible things. So, when I've been corresponding with friends in Houston, and Houston being Houston, most of these people are very prosperous people. You can see that they just simply cannot imagine that this stuff is coming up for them. This is stuff that third world peasants should be dealing with, not them. They just can't get their minds around it. So at the end of the day, what is it really? I think it's really that, most writers, most of us here are liberals who are, in some sense, and liberals are also progressives, which means that you believe in progress, which means that you believe, as our President Obama loved to say, that the arc of history tends towards something wonderful.
Well, I've been wondering about that of late.
Yes. And we begin to see, actually, there is no arc of history. History is a labyrinth through which we wander blindly, not knowing where we enter and where we exit. And it's impossible for us to fit that into the narrative, that what we are facing is a long, ugly, steady decline.
So I just want to challenge you a little bit on your assumption that sort of we love dystopias more than utopias. If you look at the most emailed articles in the New York Times, they are the human interest, feel-good kind of stories. So I think it's worth sort of putting that to a test, but producing more utopias. And not utopias in the sense that they have to be boring, but utopias in the sense that they show us a way forward.
But I think that the other part of that also is, I'm trying to write a book now, which is the companion volume to The Collapse of Western Civilization. After that book came out, I got all this email from people saying, this is great, now please write the book that tells us how it goes the other way. We can do a little companion box set, But here's the thing. It's a much, much harder book to write. It's actually much easier to see how this all goes wrong, much harder to see how we fix it and make it right.
One thing I'd like to add, though, it was interesting that you used the word communitarian, because actually that's, I think, what gets, because, we do know of two countries which are acting very fast for the future, planning long-term. One is Holland, and the other is China. And as you say in your book, China is the country that's most likely to come out of this well. What is it in common between these two countries? Why is it that they can imagine a collective future while others can't? So I would say that it's actually countries which are which have very powerful class divisions that actually will find it hardest to deal with this, because everybody will say, well, in the end, it's not me that's going to be affected, it's, those people out there. So, the whole thing about why we do these terrible things to nature, as a French philosopher said, is not because we hate nature, it's because we hate each other.
Can I just add? Yeah. I think the planet will be just fine. We're not here to save the planet. We're here to save the planet for our continued existence.
That's right.
If you haven't seen George Carlin's epically wonderful 1993 monologue on that point. Look for it online. So I'd like to start reaching out to the audience. I can't see you very well, so if someone who's managing this talk can point to people and get them a mic or whatever, that would be great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think our educational system is failing us in terms of, particularly high schools, making people having critical thinking, understanding fake news? I'll just give you two examples that were in the Times in the last week. The government in Italy is now introducing a curriculum to basically challenge fake news, while the state of New Mexico has basically taken out critical thinking on climate change. Any comments?
I have a quick question for you. Why start at high school? When kids who are 5 are
high
tweeting.
schoolers more or less interested in
Okay.
here and now, and they get most of the news out of Facebook, not reading critical thinking books.
Can I take this one?
Yeah, sure.
There's obviously lots of work that needs to be done in schools, but as a historian, one thing I've noticed, there is one thing that is perennial as the grass, and that is people complaining about education.
My
It's just-
wife is a longtime teacher, and she knows the same
yeah,
thing.
it's incredible. So, there are definitely things to be fixed, but I don't know if it's really that much worse than it ever was in the past. What I do know is I'm on the board of the National Center for Science Education, and we have a program of outreach to school teachers all across this country, focused primarily on high school, but also middle school to some extent, science teachers. So there aren't a lot of dedicated science teachers in elementary school. And most teachers are incredibly grateful and appreciative of support and help. They want to do the right thing, but they're under-resourced. So shameless plug, the National Center for Science Education. If you're not a member, please join. If you are a member, please increase your donations. And if you're a scientist, I know I'm not supposed to do that because I'm competing with our sponsors, but, and if there are any scientists in the audience, or if you know scientists, it's incredibly powerful when we get scientists in a room with teachers, where the teacher in a safe environment can just say, I really don't understand this. Can you explain to me,
Right.
The troposphere or whatever it is, because they have so few resources. And so I want to say it's really not their fault, and we need to do everything we can to help them do the good job that most of them want to do. And
Stony Brook University has a news literacy curriculum that they're promulgating all over the place, which is really important. I've written about this issue quite a bit when I was at .earth at the Times, and the thing that's lacking, it's really easy to know what's fake. It's hard to have the motivation to know what's fake. And how do you build that motivation? I encapsulated that once in, can you make veracity cool? Until veracity is cool, meaning viral, we're not going to get there. And that's grown-ups as well as I'm sure you could comment, not just kids. The woman in the red shirt here, just speak your question. It'd be simpler, and I'll repeat it. Stand up and fire away as loudly as you can.
I wanted to respond to some things you said at the very beginning regarding human psychology and the denial. And I can't imagine that human psychology in the U.S., where climate denial is a big thing, are different than people in every place else in the world that doesn't have climate denial as a major factor. The rest of the world seems to be all on board for doing things, for supporting the Paris Accord, maybe very small minorities, of course, but the U.S. is an outlier on the issue of denial.
Well, I guess a quick question would be, in surveys, is there really a meaningful difference between how people react to this, separate from policy responses?
So I think there's a range of public opinions on climate change, and certainly frontier countries like the United States, like Australia, sort of are at one end of the continuum. The kind of denialism I was talking about was really not so much to say, okay, this phenomenon doesn't exist, but just how much are we willing to actually to commit to it? How much are we willing to sacrifice to do something about it? And it turns out that climate change tends to be sort of on the list of issues people do care about, but when you sort of ask people to rank order them, all of a sudden it drops off quite precipitously. It comes in as number 15 or 16 in the United States, and I don't think that rank order is so much different in Germany. Maybe it's in the top 10, but certainly not number 1, but it might be number 9 and 10. And so I think it's a question about how deep rooted is our desire to pay attention to this issue, and how much are we willing to do about it. Because when we look at one other way in which climate change is a problem, it's once we identify what the problem is, who's the enemy? The enemy is us. And that's not a sort of pleasant issue and risk to contemplate, because that means that sort of you can't blame somebody else to do something about it. We all have to do something. And there are no simple solutions. Getting back to this not being a simple problem, there's no silver bullet. A carbon tax is not going to do it. Geoengineering is not going to do it. Sort of social change is not going to do it. They all have to work in combination. That's silver buckshot, lots of it. But that's not something that we sort of easily do. And I don't think that part is so different across different nations.
But I think, if I could just add to that, because this is a really important point, I think, you're right. I mean, people's psychology, and our questioner, people's psychology is not that different in different countries, but our political situation and our cultural situation is. And that's really crucial and important, and we do have to acknowledge that and deal with that.
When people started to applaud a few moments ago about the comment, I think it was you, Naomi, who made the comment that what's different is the politics. People applauded, and I took it to mean, I don't know what it meant, why people applauded, but I took it to mean the very current politics, the president that we have, for example, and all that he has created. But politics have been a problem since climate change has been a problem, or maybe not all the way back, because there's a lot of collusion between government and industry that's been denied.
Right.
We don't talk enough about that.
Yeah, I'm going to take that to actually an extra level. The question was about how politics is not just as simple as Trump, no Trump, on an issue like climate change. And I'll just give you a big yes with an exclamation point by noting a piece I wrote for ProPublica earlier this year. When Trump announced the Paris pullout, I looked around the landscape and noticed that, I had been at a meeting on sustainable energy, and there was a European Union official who had just told me, that was in April, before Trump's thing, that they were very happy they'd gotten to meet with the Trump administration about fast-tracking U.S. exports of natural gas as LNG to Europe. So Europe has this green sheen right now because they're in the climate Paris seat, but they're beholden to us for our abundant natural gas, so they're not beholden to Vladimir Putin. And that there's levels of hypocrisy and disconnections that I guess that's why media still matter, I'll say. But it's not just media. If people aren't asking those system questions, then and really examining that question why things aren't happening or are happening, or if there isn't a bad guy, then what's the bad system or what's the problem here? Then it's a big fail for all of us.
Whoa, there are bad guys. I mean,
of course there are. As we at ProPublica know well. So yes, there are bad guys, but there are also these. Shell is a Dutch company, and Shell is happily expanding their footprint in Africa is unbelievable, and they're not doing much about flaring, and they're paying for people to get better cook stoves. So it's like there's all kinds of issues.
In relation to Holland, I wasn't speaking of mitigation, but rather of preparedness.
Yeah. Well, they had their epic 1953 existential flood event, which I think makes a big difference too. There must be more questions, and I'm sure I'm probably missing you because you're right in the front.
Continue this question of systems. Is given the prevalence of the corporate world, and they are not strictly a uniform policy position, can we envision a way in which corporate resources can somehow be organized in some structural way to be brought to bear on the solution? And would that have to be a global system? I mean, have we kind of gone beyond the usefulness of the nation state and able to address the global issues? And if there were a global solution, would it not have to in some way include the corporate entities which contain half the world's resources?
Yeah. So can corporate world be more a part of the solution, and what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that a lot, and I think the answer is absolutely yes, although the way I view it is not so much global, but going the other way, state-based, regional, provincial. Because actually, if you think about what's going on in the private sector, You have a small number of really bad actors, mostly fossil fuel companies, but a few others that I call part of the carbon combustion complex. But then you also have a lot of companies that are just kind of standing on the sidelines waiting to see what government will do, and that's what corporations usually do, right? Most corporations don't actually want to be out in front. It's like most institutions in general don't actually want to be out in front because they feel too vulnerable if they do. So I think that's one reason why the Risky Business Report was so important. I think it's incredibly important for the business community to be supporting initiatives either on the state level or the regional level, to be working with state governments, to be thinking about, how could a carbon tax be implemented, for example, in the state. And we've seen this happening in California, starting to happen a little bit in Massachusetts. I don't know as much about what's happening in New York, but I think there's tremendous opportunities there. And I also think that there's an opportunity for a politically effective divide and conquer strategy. I think we have to isolate ExxonMobil and the other fossil fuel companies who are continuing to aggressively search for new resources of fossil fuels, continuing to fund disinformation, and to say, that's not the business world. That's the world of the fossil fuel industry, and maybe cement. I don't know. We'll have to think about cement. But we know we can live without fossil fuels. That's the important thing. I mean, one of the big lies that ExxonMobil has been perpetuating, you saw it in the advertisements during the Olympics, right? About how we can't live without energy. Well, that's true, but we can live without fossil fuels. So there's a conflation between fossil fuels and energy, and that conflation needs to be broken.
Amitav, if we had time, I'd ask you, maybe you could fit it in while I ask. There's going to be one more question, so, and it was one that we already picked out, but this TV series on, it's not Netflix, Mr. Robot, Evil Corp is this entity that, is there any story you know of in history where the corporation is good, is the good character?
Of course, Naomi's right. There are terrible corporations. But I think, one thing we just completely leave out of this whole equation is that it's not the corporations that are the biggest consumers of energy and the biggest emitters, even in America. The single biggest consumer of carbon, of fossil fuels, single biggest emitter is the Pentagon. In one year, in its Middle East operations alone, the Pentagon uses more fossil fuels than the entire nation of Bangladesh, a country of 180 million people. So, do you really see a circumstance where we are going to tell the Pentagon to cut back? Do we see that happening?
They've claimed to have been doing quite a bit with green biofuels and stuff. That doesn't approach the scale we were talking about. There's one last question, and I really thank everybody for compressing so much good thought into so little time.
Looking now at the fossil fuel industry and how climate change has become one of those cultural memes, it's like reproductive rights. It's such a third-rail issue.
Mm-hmm.
What can we learn from the success of overcoming the merchants of doubt that we can apply to overcoming the fossil merchants of doubt?
Well, it gets back to what I just said a minute ago. One of the reasons why we were able to get some successful action against tobacco is because the tobacco industry was isolated from other companies. And one of the interesting things that the tobacco industry tried to do, they tried to create alliances with the alcohol industry, for example. And one of the things the alcohol industry said was, you must be kidding. We have a good product. Why would we associate wine and beer with smoking? And so the alcohol industry actually was very smart about protecting itself by not creating an alliance with an industry that they saw as much more problematic than their own. So I think the similar kind of thing can be done here, where we can acknowledge that, obviously the corporate landscape is really, really complicated, but there are companies that are moving ahead with solar, with wind, with battery storage technology, with energy efficiency, energy efficient lighting. It's something you can do at home in your house. If you come to my house, I become like a total, evangelist for energy efficiency lighting. My whole house is now LEDs. How many of you have LEDs in your house? Wow, okay. So I don't have to tell you, but tell all your friends. I make people come to my house and I say, touch my LEDs. And of course, it's such a shock to most people because they have no idea. And then you realize all that heat in an old-fashioned incandescent light is waste, right? And that's something we can all do ourselves. And it's modest, it's not giant, but it does make a difference. And I think these kinds of things can be part of a trend. At least that's my hope. Otherwise, it's
Yeah. And any last message to the world?
Just like the Pentagon, U.S. Army and Navy actually are part of the government who are quite concerned about climate change and quite aware of those issues.
Yeah.
They are consuming a lot of energy, but they're also very concerned about energy waste and trying to introduce a culture change within their own ranks. So just like a little word of defense.
You see it happening, an F-16 running on biofuels? I don't think so.
Well, drones, I guess, are more energy efficient. Oh boy, let's not go down that road. Anyway, should everybody be writing, communicating their own stories about this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Not just people we label as artists, but everybody in this room.
yes, everybody should be writing.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
I hope you're enjoying the program, and if you are, I'd like to invite you back to other programs in our series, all of which are listed on our website. The next one is entitled Greening the Grid, New York's Energy Future. It's taking place on Tuesday, December 5th, and it'll focus on the future of energy in New York, including such things as the rise of renewables and efforts to create microgrids and community-based approaches to energy infrastructure. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our panel.
A round of applause, everybody. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Bartiz Cox. I am the Communications Director at Climate Nexus. We're a small nonprofit that does a lot of communications and policy consulting for nonprofits, grassroots organizations all over the country. I want to thank the City Museum of New York for hosting this panel and for everyone for coming today. And beautiful Sunday afternoon. There's a lot of things you could be doing, but you decided to spend it with us, and we really appreciate that. Want to introduce each of the panelists really quickly. We have Cecil Corbin-Mark. He's the Deputy Director of We Act for Environmental Justice. We have Mary Mattingly, a visual artist and founder of Swale, a floating food forest built atop a barge. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's incredible. I think it's on your programs, actually. And I'm Janae Foster. I'm the Climate Justice Policy Coordinator at Uprose. So, this is a very timely discussion. Over the last few months, we've seen the devastating impact that climate change can have on our communities across the country, across the world. The wildfires in California, which have caused people to lose homes, the utter devastation of Puerto Rico in wake of hurricanes Harvey and Maria, where the majority of residents are still without electricity. Public health is becoming a serious issue, and the course of these impacts, it extends. We're seeing this day by day. It's getting worse and worse. Many of us have family, friends in Puerto Rico, Houston, the Caribbean, and this is not news to us. We know that the most effective strategies for helping people care about and act on climate change are to make it real for them and help them understand that this is happening here and now. Otherwise, our brains don't register the threat. Thus, the role of communities is essential. People need to know how and where climate change is happening in their own backyard, and we've seen in America a top-down approach does not seem to be the silver bullet. The Trump administration openly undermining any action on climate change at the federal level provides an opening for other entities to step up and fill the vacuum created by the administration. And we've seen that happening all over the place. Since the president announced that he plans to pull out of the Paris Agreement, 382 cities signed onto the climate mayor's letter objecting to pull out from the agreement. 246 cities have signed on to We're Still In. 150 mayors have signed up to go 100% clean energy as part of the Ready for 100 campaign, and the count goes on. And we're seeing cities step up in huge ways all across the country. New York City is a part of this action. The day that Trump announced that he would pull out of the agreement, Bill de Blasio signed an executive order that commits our city to goals in the Paris Agreement and accelerates some of its greenhouse gas emissions goals into 2020 to keep global temperature rise at or below 1.5 degrees. Yet there's still more to do here in the city. Citizens around the boroughs are still waiting for Superstorm Sandy relief. That was 5 years ago. And every day residents deal with negative health effects of living near fossil fuel powered plants and many other issues in New York as well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So today we're going to explore what communities around New York City are doing to address climate change and its impacts, including tools and innovations they've developed, what's needed to invigorate community members, and the obstacles and successes they've had. It's our hope that much of this discussion can serve as inspiration for everyone here today to support community action on climate change. It's clear that we have a lot of work to do, and this work starts at the community level where we can begin to break down societal barriers that prevent us from fully addressing this issue and find opportunities for intersection and progress. So today, we'll hear from these three inspiring leaders in the city and hear some of their presentations. And then after that, we'll have a brief panel discussion and we'll open it up for questions from all of you. But before we get started, I want to ask you all a question that we'll answer closer to the end. But, you know, how many of you, with a raise of hand, have seen impacts of climate change in your life or can foresee how it will begin to impact your communities going forward? Quite a few. That's great. All right, wonderful. Okay, I think the first presentation we'll have is from Cecil. Take it away.
Great. Good afternoon, and I just want to say thanks to all those who were behind putting this event together, and thanks to our moderator for stepping in at the last minute. So, my name is Cecil Corbin-Mark. I'm the Deputy Director of React for Environmental Justice. We are a 29-year-old environmental justice organization that is a membership-based organization located here in northern Manhattan. We believe in working on changing policy by engaging local residents in the process of changing those policies. We work around environment and environmental health policy, and we believe that, you know, in order for us to really create change in our communities, that people need to be at the center, particularly those who are most impacted by some of the things that are going on in our lives, need to be at the center of creating the policies that actually govern our daily lives. And so obviously, when it comes to the issue of climate, back a couple of years ago in 2014, we worked with the support of the Kresge Foundation to engage Northern Manhattan residents in a community vision and climate resiliency planning process. We ran 4 workshops covering the 4 community boards that cover Northern Manhattan. We had, prior to those workshops, a series of educational workshops to engage people with climate and climate change and climate resilience. The key question that we asked people in those workshops, which there were more than 400 people attending all 4 of those workshops, the key question that we asked people was, if you had to go through another Superstorm Sandy, what do you think you would need to create greater resilience in your community? How do you think you could survive that? What do you think you would need to not just survive, but actually come out on the other end thriving? And out of that came a huge outpouring of information. Obviously, when you tell New Yorkers, tell us what you want or what you need, they have a lot of opinions. And, but a couple of the things sort of caught our attention because they were repeated many, many times. People talked a lot about energy. They talked about the impact of being without power, their fear about being without power, their lack of control over the issue of power. And they said that they thought that was a key thing that needed to be addressed. Not all of Northern Manhattan lost power, but some of the residents, particularly over here in East Harlem where we are located, East Harlem El Barrio, there were a number of residents, particularly in public housing, East River houses, Wilson houses, a number of others, Wrangell houses further north in central Harlem. Many of them were impacted by floods, and some of them had loss of power issues. Certainly not to the level, for example, of some of our fellow New Yorkers in Red Hook or out in the Rockaways, or even in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But Northern Manhattan was also impacted by Superstorm Sandy, and so people had that as a fairly clear memory. So power was a key issue. And then out of that sort of talk around power, we worked with the residents who came forward to actually come to a framing idea of energy democracy. Now, we didn't create the idea of energy democracy. It is a term that is out there and certainly predates our work. But we thought that that was apt, and we worked with the residents who came to the community planning process to really construct a frame for what ultimately became our Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan, a frame around energy democracy. The second big thing that people repeatedly talked about was being prepared in an emergency. we conducted our workshops in English and in Spanish. We often do our work in that manner, given the communities that we operate in and who our members are as an organization. And it came up repeatedly again from not just the Spanish speakers, but even the English speakers, that people were struck by the fact that in a time of crisis, the then Mayor Bloomberg would use that as an opportunity to roll out his Spanish. And people felt like that was, not the best time for you to be doing something like that. And certainly those who were either Spanish dominant speakers or those who might be bilingual in our process talked about the fact that, that made them uneasy, and that they felt as though communication was really important, making sure that they had information. They also felt that the information that they got was not sort of culturally sensitive or appropriate, or that it didn't even give them the basics of things that they thought they might need, like where is the evacuation center that I need to go to in my neighborhood? So they talked about emergency preparedness, and sort of our second organizing bucket for the Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan that we developed with the residents was around emergency preparedness. I'll spend a couple of seconds talking about the emergency preparedness, but I want to spend bulk of the time talking about the energy democracy piece. And so for emergency preparedness, we focus on bringing that concept to life through our Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan by training more people on things like the emergency response training. So there's a community emergency response training process that the city works in collaboration with residents in the city and trains people. And so we've tried to get a number of our members and various community leaders to take on that training and to be available to community residents with the knowledge that they have in terms of community emergency readiness training. And we are continuing to push that forward. But given some of the critiques about cultural appropriateness and language access and those types of things, we are also working to try to make sure that we offer critiques to the city about how best to sort of make the trainings that they offer more culturally relevant and culturally appropriate. And also trying to make sure that we push for greater language accessibility of those trainings. So that's one thing. But we're also working beyond that in terms of engaging residents in a process of collecting their stories about surviving, their stories about thriving, and making that available through a network that we're trying to build, a communications network that we're trying to build. We've targeted college radio stations, so the colleges that have radio stations in Northern Manhattan. City College has signed on. We're in talks right now with Columbia University's radio station. Up in Washington Heights, Yeshiva has a radio station, and so we're talking with them as well. And we want to bring those radio stations into a network that allows for local residents to have a place to know directly to go that will hopefully provide more relevant community information and more culturally relevant emergency preparedness information as well. Beyond those radio stations that I listed, we hope to target some of the gospel radio stations that many seniors in the community listen to and many people who are participating in faith communities listen to. And then we will continue moving on to try to build a robust network that includes not just fixed radio stations, but Wi-Fi networks and the like. And so we're building our own sort of Northern Manhattan communication structure as we move forward to do that we think, we hope with the input and direction from community residents here in Northern Manhattan, as well as some of our members, that we'll be able to be more culturally relevant and more community appropriate in terms of the information that they are able to give in event of another climactic crisis. We're also working directly with residents to design and ultimately get built a prototype emergency kiosk. And we're working with residents in public housing, particularly at the Manhattanville development in West Harlem, to work on programming for an emergency preparedness kiosk. They have aptly named it EPIC, Emergency Preparedness Information Kiosk is what EPIC stands for. And so they are in the midst right now of working with a wonderful group called City is Living Laboratory Call to help design that kiosk and then to work with the residents in the building to program it and then to put it through the participatory budgeting process, which if you don't know about, you should check out in the city, and make sure that it actually gets built on a particular campus, and then we will, once it's built, see how it goes, and then hopefully move that to other public housing campuses or other particular developments across northern Manhattan that are interested in having it. So we want to work on a prototype and sort of work out some of the kinks if there are any, and then ultimately begin to move that across northern Manhattan. So those are some of the things. So training, building a communications network that is local, that has more culturally appropriate and culturally and community aware information to provide to local residents in northern Manhattan about the things that you may need in an emergency. And then also working with residents to build a prototype emergency preparedness information kiosk that can also serve as a physical place in certain communities that we can actually have people access in times of need. So that's the emergency preparedness bucket. Back to the energy democracy bucket. On the energy democracy, one of the things that people talked about was how much they pay for electricity. And clearly, when you come to communities of color in this country, in particular, that's a very high electricity burden. I think we all pay a lot for electricity, but I want to lift up the idea that when it comes to a percentage of their income, there's a very high electricity burden for low-income communities, and particularly for communities of color in this country. And so folks have, in our energy democracy framing for our Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan, have really talked about wanting to get to the point where we're in control of producing electricity in our communities. And so one of the ways that we are operationalizing that is by working with a number of amazing partners under something called the City Solar Initiative. We're working with the City University of New York Sustainable CUNY operation, as well as Solar One, who has been an amazing partner. And we're also working with a couple of other folks to help us begin to put solar panels on the roofs of buildings in northern Manhattan so that we can begin to generate more of our power locally here in northern Manhattan. But we're not targeting every single building. We're targeting very specifically affordable housing in this community. We want to first start by lowering the energy costs for affordable housing in this community. Now, we can have a debate about what is affordable and what is not, because that's a very serious issue for a lot of communities, especially right here in East Harlem, where we've just gone through the development of an East Harlem neighborhood plan, and there's a potential rezoning that's moving forward at the city. But for us, we're really talking about low to moderate income households. We're talking about folks who are in the middle class in New York City and who live in northern Manhattan, and we're talking about those who are in the lower economic spectrum who live in housing in New York City. And we're targeting those buildings that are owned by those low to moderate income New Yorkers who live in the buildings. So we're looking at HDFC cooperatives. We're looking at affordable housing that is either mission-driven, owned or operated by mission-driven organizations, and we're working with those organizations to advance putting solar on those rooftops.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Cecil, I don't want to interrupt, but I'm going to keep it moving on
Okay.
to Mary. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the affordable housing stuff when we get to the questions. This is really interesting stuff, but thank you, Cecil, really appreciate it.
Thanks. I'm going to show some images. I'm eager to share some thoughts about Swale and some thoughts about what can drive us as creators and maintainers and about strengthening common spaces. So through working on Swale pictured here, I've been able to see what I'll call active artwork, how it can be buttressed and cared for. So from people from art, agriculture, and conservation, and people who care about fresh food, clean water, and healthy land, all steward Swale in different ways. So for me, this is a reminder that cross-disciplinary efforts need to be strengthened, and that a continued awareness for our interconnectedness leaves us with less room for indifference. So a few years ago, I bundled almost everything I owned and pulled the bundles through New York City in order to emphasize the weight of these objects, where they were mined, produced, and distributed around the world. So I grew up in an agricultural town nearby where the drinking water was polluted from pesticides, where the food that was produced went into the city and the garbage came back out. I've thought of living systems and ecosystems all of my life, and I'd like to share a few examples of how experiential artworks can bring about new desires. So I believe sculpture is experiential, durational, and alive. This is a sphere made from drywall stud left over from building sites that held edible plants, gravity-fed irrigation, and fish in tanks that also enjoy the plants. Like a small permaculture system, they fed each other. Wading Bridge spanned 42 feet of the nitrate-filled Raccoon River in Des Moines, Iowa. Only 20 feet of the Wading Bridge was able to be 6 inches underwater to encourage people to take their shoes off and walk through it. Wading Bridge invited people into a river most people either feared or ignored. It flooded and was filled with runoff from farms next door. So through projects like Wading Bridge, I believe that we can revalue ways of understanding a place. And what happens when we transform objects and materials with past histories together in order to tell complex stories? Wetland was conceived as a public floating sculpture. It was built from an old fiberglass houseboat hull and a gymnasium floor. It resembled a submerged building and functioned as a workshop and event space for global warming. As a proposal for interdependent structures throughout the city, an ecosystem on a boat can be a profound space. Since it's contained, it offers a window into an entire living system on a scale that's possible for visitors to comprehend and stewards to easily care for. From gardens feeding livestock to humans, to bees and leftover compost feeding the gardens. The wakes from other boats symbolically describe our connections, how everything we do affects someone else somewhere else. So Swale is a provocative public artwork in a floating food forest in New York City. Growing or picking food on New York's public land has been illegal for almost a century for fear that a glut of foragers could destroy an ecosystem. Swale came out of learning that in addition to over 100 acres of community garden space in New York City, the city cares for 30,000 acres of parkland. People can visit Swale to pick edible and medicinal foods for free. Swale follows the insights of Elinor Ostrom and others who found that commons can be sustainably managed where people know each other, care for each other, trust each other, and work together in caring for a place. There's no imposed limit to forage on Swale, but when it launched in 2006 on the Bronx River and there was not much ripe to pick, on some days we found more people bringing plants than taking them. So more recently it struck me that Swale and works like Swale are really about love, that social love is itself a commons. It's what moves us to devise larger strategies together that encourage care. As a direct result of Swale and the support of community groups, the New York City Parks Department just opened their first land-based pilot, a public foodway at Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx. If it goes well, they may do more. An architectural folly is something that's out of place in order to surprise us and ask us to reconsider our surroundings. While urban food forests won't feed a city, a multitude of different questions and answers that are closer to home are necessary if we're going to begin to heal from the damage done to the environment, ourselves and our neighbors by industrial systems of production. So at its heart, I believe Swale is a call to action. It asks us to re-envision our food systems. It asks us to protect clean water as a human right and to understand food as a human right too. And I'll show you a quick video about Swale.
Good. Edible flower. This is one of our favorites. Produced very well here on board. Try some.
Right now in New York City, almost all of our food comes from outside. It's not as fresh because of that, and it's much more expensive. we also have the output, so all of the garbage that's created from the packaging of this food coming into the city. So it started with an idea, what if, like clean water is a human right, what if food could be that way too? And what could a city like New York look like, and how could it function if that was the case here? That was kind of the thinking behind doing Swale, is that if we could do this space on the water, we could travel from place to place. Where we were in the South Bronx is definitely considered the biggest food desert in the United States.
Mary, she pointed out to us, it's illegal to grow fruits and vegetables in public parks. There's no laws about growing vegetables and fruits and herbs on the water. So we found a loophole to get around.
Swale was an interesting kind of provocation. Of course, New York City's not going to feed itself from one floating barge, but she can capture the imagination of individuals that visit, of kids telling them, yes, you're allowed to pick this food. What conversation do you want to start?
Have you ever planted any fruits or vegetables? Do you eat fresh fruits and vegetables?
What if these kinds of spaces could be available in our public parks here in New York City? How we use urban land. What if our systems of food supply and distribution looked a little bit different?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Janae Foster and I'm the Climate Justice Policy and Programs Coordinator at UPROSE. UPROSE is an intergenerational, multiracial environmental justice organization based in the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn, which is founded in the 1960s by Puerto Rican activists. Our mission is to promote environmental justice, sustainability, climate resilience in Sunset Park through community organizing, community-based planning, leadership development, and arts and culture programming. Sunset Park is a working-class community of color located along Brooklyn's industrial waterfront. Sunset Park is home to a large Latino, Asian, and Middle Eastern population and is the largest walk-to-work community in New York. It's also one of New York's last manufacturing districts. The community has experienced a long legacy of environmental racism. And UPROSE has worked with community residents to fight for transit justice, open space access, brownfield remediation, and clean energy. At UPROSE, I coordinate the Sunset Park Climate Justice Center, a community-based climate resiliency initiative to promote local climate adaptation and mitigation projects. This initiative was born out of residents who experienced the impacts of Superstorm Sandy firsthand. We've worked with them to create a community action plan that identifies how community members can lead when it comes to emergency response and taking climate solutions into their own hands. The Climate Justice Center's Block Captain program is one such initiative to create a block-by-block network of local residents who conduct vulnerability assessments, identifying where elders live, where people who have limited English proficiency live, and they lead in popular education workshops, such as community emergency response trainings. And they also identify opportunities for local resiliency projects on their block. Where can rain barrels be put for community climate resiliency? Where can there be a rooftop garden? Things like that. And the Climate Justice Center also houses the Protect Our Working Waterfront Alliance. And community members in this coalition fight to preserve affordability and community cohesion. And they fight to preserve the industrial waterfront for a just transition away from fossil fuels to a renewable and clean energy economy. This coalition is fighting to preserve community stability and opportunities for green jobs on the Sunset Park waterfront through an anti-displacement campaign. And I'm going to show a short little video slideshow to help get a sense of what this looks like on the ground.
I've got a few questions. I'm sure many people here do as well. But we've just seen three different stories of how we can look at climate change and address it. This is a question I'd like to open up for all three of you. But what are the opportunities for intersection? Where are you seeing these opportunities in your day-to-day? We all know that you can't talk about climate change without talking about economic impacts, health, racial divisions. How are you dealing with this, and how are you integrating that into the work you're doing, whether that's architecture at Uprose or doing, energy justice work?
Can everyone hear me? No more tech issues. So at Uprose, we organize for a just transition. So for us, this is moving away from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And so communities of color and low-income communities have often been targeted for fossil fuel industries, and we've had to deal with extracting our labor, extracting our natural resources, and things like that. And we live with the toxic burdens and legacies and inequitable wealth distribution from all of these things. And so it's integral to us to integrate labor and housing and land rights and all these things as we approach climate justice, because our people face multiple systems of oppression. And so therefore, in this transition to a new economic system that works for the planet and for people, it's really integral to not only look at issues of the natural environment, but also issues of social justice, and really weave them together.
So local food, I think, is a way that Swale or projects like it can address climate change and be part of that conversation. I think part of Swale is being aspirational, and so it can be both a tool that's a functional space, but it's also kind of another type of tool for thinking about potentially utopias, or unfortunately utopias, because that shouldn't be, right? It shouldn't be that we can't go into a public park and pick an apple off of a tree, but it is because we're in such a litigious city. So it's trying to rethink those types of things and coalition build at the same time. So what we're working on now is how can we potentially partner with a nonprofit who's doing work in this space. So we're not working in the same space, but fighting for resources. So we're thinking about how these lots of coalition building can continue to happen, basically.
I think that intersectionality is a new term for a lot of people, but for many low to moderate income communities, and particularly communities of color, the idea of having things in their lives sort of cut across various sectors is not new at all. And so from our standpoint, when we brought people together to talk about the creating greater climate resilience in Northern Manhattan, they brought up the issue of jobs. They brought up the issue of health. They brought up the issue of how do we make sure that, for example, in the next Superstorm Sandy, people are able to have access to their medicines and to be able to get to drugstores or food places where they need to access food. So very directly, as we crafted our Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan, we tried to respond to that. So on the front of creating economic opportunity and activity, one of the things that we have done, we just signed a contract with a solar installer. And we've targeted, as I said, affordable housing in Northern Manhattan. The solar installer that won the award had to prove to the residents and members of WEACT who were reviewing the bids that came in response to our RFP that they could hire and sustain a local workforce from the people that we trained in our existing worker training program. And so for us, that is a manifestation of how we operationalize intersectionality. We've heard people say that people in our community don't have enough good jobs, and so we're providing training free of charge to them to be able to then get OSHA, asbestos licenses, scaffolding training, flagging training, et cetera. But then we're taking that the next step and saying, if we're putting solar on the roofs of buildings, affordable housing in Northern Manhattan, then the people who are coming out of that training need to be trained to install those solar panels on that rooftop. That's one example. Another example is people wanted to have more control over their energy. Those were, the things that people said. And so we are focused on how do we make sure that we move along as we start to put solar on top of each building. How do we begin to connect that in a microgrid in northern Manhattan so that it is long-term more sustainable? And what does it mean, for example, to put those connections, that microgrid, into an urban cooperative? And so we're working with Fordham University's Community Legal Clinic to figure out what's the structure for that ultimately down the road when we get to the place where we are connected to more places in northern Manhattan through solar power, panels on the roofs, and solar battery storage in our communities. So those are some of the ways that we see connecting these various challenges of economy and health as well. Because when we take, as we take fossil fuels out of the current grid and supplement that with solar power, we're reducing the amount of pollution that triggers respiratory illnesses in our community. And so while we're also tackling the issue of climate change. And so those are the ways in which we sort of try to operationalize that concept of intersectionality.
Interesting. Well, this makes me think, I think about, what's going on at the federal level, and it looks like all of you work very closely to the ground with people in low and middle income communities. Do you feel like what's happening at the national level is galvanizing people here in New York and making them want to come and see what's happening at Swale or show up to the Uprose community events? Is this something that you're seeing on the ground?
I mean, I think it's making people angry, and I think that is also a result of, feeling powerless. And I do think that if we can think about what could make us feel less powerless potentially within the subject of this huge subject of climate change, then I think we can translate that anger into something else. But I think right now what I'm seeing a lot of is people are angry about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and for us, I would say that environmental justice communities and communities of color, they've been organizing for these issues for decades. And so this is not new. The government, historically has not used words like climate change. And so pushing sort of back against these systems is ongoing. But what we have seen is that we continue to see, as climate change worsens, that communities of color continue to be hit first and worst by climate change. So we can see that in the Caribbean with what's going on now with Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And so residents have been coming to us even more fired up to work on these issues. And so they came to us noticing that a lot of the sort of dialogue in Puerto Rico, so Sunset Park is one of the largest Puerto Rican communities in Brooklyn. And so residents have come to us thinking about how they can support their family abroad and make sure that the conversation is not just focused on emergency preparedness, but actually how Puerto Ricans can gain their sovereignty and really push for a just transition and a just recovery so that they're able to take control of their own energy systems and food sovereignty and really push back against the fossil fuel economy that has extracted so many resources and left 23 Superfund sites in Puerto Rico. So through the Our Power campaign, we're really mobilizing to get resources from here and non-GMO seeds and compost actually to people in Puerto Rico so that they can fight for a just transition and a just recovery.
I mean, I think that there's definitely a decided uptick in terms of people's engagement about what is happening at the federal level. And I think it's in direct response to the present administration at 1600 Pennsylvania. But I also think that, as Janaea was pointing out, that there's been a lot of work that has been going on in communities like Northern Manhattan, whether it's El Barrio or West Harlem or Central Harlem or Washington Heights and Inwood, around how do we sort of, begin to deal with the aftermath of things like a Superstorm Sandy, or what's going on with our brothers and sisters in Puerto Rico or Houston or Florida. That said, yes, very directly to your question, I think that people are engaged. I know that we were we participated in a steering committee for the Second People's Climate March that took place last year. And we, as did Uprose, and so we were able to mobilize 164 of our members to actually go down to Washington, D.C. to send a very clear message to the current administration that this is a priority for most communities. When you poll, particularly in African American and Latino communities, on their readiness to fix the climate crisis problem or to engage or to push government for solutions, they poll exceedingly high, higher than sort of other communities across this country as well. And so I think that we are definitely very engaged and very focused, but that focus has to start at the grassroots and fixing the problems locally that people are concerned with. And then I think it becomes clearer why their engagement at the federal level is important, because they're either seeking some sets of resources or some sets of policy change to support resilience on the ground in their communities. I think that's critical.
So I mean, I feel like, since we're in a museum, we have Mary here. I feel like art is a crucial component to this conversation. I play in a number of bands in New York, and I feel like one thing I see is people are trying to find ways, artists are trying to find ways to connect what they do to the larger issues of climate change, racial injustice, you name it. So what are some things you're seeing, Mary, in the art community of artists stepping up and making this connection? Something I personally want to know more, and I know you're probably a little closer to it than I am.
I think I see things happening on different levels that are pretty exciting. I think artists are considering the materials that we choose to use and the potential harm that they have on the people who make them, the environment, that includes the water, the air, the soil, everything. I think that people are thinking about how art can also be a tool for policy change, and that can be, I think, pretty greatly described by a piece by Aviva Romani, who is working on this Blue Trees Symphony, where she and others are painting some trees blue with some milk paint on property that was slated to have a pipeline go through it, to see if they can use copyright law to stop that pipeline from happening. And I think there are exciting ways that art can continue to be thought of in really creative spaces like that. So.
It looks like from Uprose, I noticed that looks like you use like art and singers as a way of like getting the community to come out, right?
Yeah, so for us, arts and culture is also super important. And I think it speaks to what Cecil was talking about in terms of community engagement and making sure that it's culturally relevant. When youth, are able to come to our youth open mic and see people talking about climate change and livable economies and a just transition through poetry or through hip hop, it's empowering. It connects the people one-on-one. Also, the cultural piece too. Climate change comes with a lot of trauma, and being able to really talk about histories of resistance when it comes to communities of color. A lot of traditional art forms, such as bomba, which is big in the Puerto Rican community. It's a Afro-Puerto Rican dance form and music form, where people are really able to engage with this topic in a way that invites their culture and a richer dialogue. So it's something that we use often.
Similar to Uprose, we use culture as a way of engaging people. One of the easiest portals to get people to come to these issues, I think, is through art and culture. And language is a part of our culture as well, and so making things accessible is also really important. But I think obviously we're talking more about either the visual, spoken, sung, or other types of art. And so for us, a perfect example was, again, we heading into the People's Climate March, the second People's Climate March, we held a day before, or the Saturday, one of the weekends before, we held a huge sort of art build to really engage people in the community. And we had over 100 people show up for the art build, young people, older people, everybody in between. And so it was really amazing, because that way people felt as though they could contribute, even if they weren't able to go down to Washington, D.C. for the march, they were able to contribute something to it. Another thing I would encourage people, there's this amazing group, and we've worked with them on different points when we've had conferences around climate change. There's a group called Climbing Poetry, and if you haven't seen them in operation, I encourage you all to check them out. So Heads Up,
We're in that
Snap
video.
Snaps the Climate and Poetry. It's a group that we've worked with since 2009, and we think they're just superly talented and amazing. But yeah, it's important to connect. I mean, we express ourselves as a culture through art and music and other art forms as well, and so why would we leave that out in an effort to sort of transform ourselves to greater resilience and a different kind of economy as well?
Great. We're jumping all over today, so I'm going to shift gears again. Earlier, we heard a little bit about affordable housing, energy justice. One thing that I haven't heard mentioned yet, but I think it's crucial to this, especially to us as New Yorkers, is gentrification and how that intersects with climate change. And I know all three of you are probably looking at this issue and working on this issue. What are some of the things Uprose is doing to kind of address this, especially in Sunset Park?
Yeah, so we cannot achieve climate justice without tackling the issue of gentrification and displacement. So as I mentioned in my presentation, I lead the Protect Our Working Waterfront Alliance, which is our anti-gentrification and anti-displacement campaign. And so what we're finding is that we have engaged community members in creating community-based plans. And so their input has already been channeled into this process that identified a vision for the waterfront. And the community vision for the waterfront is an industrial waterfront that preserves the industrial sector, where people are able to go to green jobs that provide and build for New York City's resilient infrastructure. But what we're finding is that developers are, trying to capitalize on the cheap land that there is already and trying to rezone the industrial waterfront to bring in things that are not in line with the community needs, such as luxury hotels and boutique stores and all of these things that'll put more pressure on residents and drive them out. So we cannot continue to fight for climate justice without tackling this issue, because a community that's fragmented and that is not cohesive is not a climate resilient community. A community that has suffered from the toxic legacy of the fossil fuel industry should have the opportunities to really flip the script and actually build for the just transition. But we cannot do this with continued land speculation and converting of industrial land to luxury high-end uses. So it's one and the same for us.
The reason that we focused so directly on low to moderate income housing that's owned by the residents or that is operated by mission-driven affordable housing organizations in the Northern Manhattan community was as a direct result of our members talking about gentrification. And it came up in the planning processes we had in East Harlem, Central Harlem, West Harlem, and Washington Heights and Inwood. And so given our mission as an organization, we're not a housing or tenants' rights organization. We're an environmental justice organization. We really tried to figure out what within our wheelhouse as a mission-driven organization we could do to address that problem. And it's really about our energy democracy. Most people who live in this country spend their money in three various categories. They're either paying for housing, they're paying for food, or they're paying for transportation. When you look at the low to moderate income, that's where they're spending their money in this country. The wealthiest few of us who live here spend their money mostly on insurance and retirement planning and securing their fortunes for either themselves or future generations. So that's a very stark disparity. And when you look at housing in particular, after people pay either rent or mortgage, those who live in the low to moderate income bracket, like myself, after you pay your rent or your mortgage, your next largest chunk of cost for your housing is your energy cost. And if you remember, I was talking about energy burden earlier in the conversation. It's a very significant thing for low-income communities in general, but African American and Latino communities in particular. And so we very deliberately targeted reducing energy costs by putting solar panels on affordable housing in Northern Manhattan as a way to tackle that conversation head on. We believe that if we are able to lower energy costs, we're reducing some of the financial pressures in a rising energy cost world that are affecting very significantly the ability for people to stay in their housing to the extent that it remains affordable. And so for us, that's a very direct response to this question of gentrification. We'll see how it goes. We've just gotten the first of our buildings. We have a goal of 150 kilowatts signed up for 2017, and of that 150, we've got 105, signed up. And so, we're hoping to be able to measure this as we go forward to actually see the impact that we're having on people's cost.
Can I just add one more thing to that? So also New York City, particularly Sunset Park as well, is a high renter population and renter community, and climate solutions are expensive. So we have been working on different policy initiatives and in coalition to make sure that these energy solutions that we talk about, whether it be energy retrofits or solar, are actually accessible to the people who need them the most and that are the most vulnerable to climate change. So I just wanted to add that in there.
I also wanted to think about how, with increased climate change, there will be increased gentrification, and we're seeing that in places like Miami right now, and it makes me think about one way that I've seen art used, which I thought was really fascinating, where 6 community groups in the Lower East Side got together. There's a Pier 36 that was being used as a junkyard, and then it was slated to be developed, and these 6 community groups got together and said, if we can employ art permits for 5 years and get more people to this site, we can build a coalition so we can change this into something else. It doesn't need to be this development. And over 5 years of having these temporary art permits, they did get enough momentum to turn it into a public park instead of a condo. And I think, that possibilities like that and bringing art into the picture to build momentum is important.
Great. Well, we're going to move to Q&As for the last 15 minutes. I think we have a couple people with microphones, but if you'd like to ask a question, feel free. Right up here in the blue, I think you got his hand up first.
Okay.
All right.
But I'd like to know what specific educational programs do you plan or do you contemplate in having that will work with the kids in your own community to make them understand the importance of climate change, the importance of our environment to our existence?
So integrating youth into environmental justice planning and climate justice work is really important and integral to Uprose. In the summertime, we actually employ youth in the Summer Youth Leadership Program to actually go out into the community and organize around climate justice, and it's a lot of their introductions into this world and what it means for their own communities. It's really integral, and we also work with public schools, and our young people will go into the public schools and actually create curriculum as well as lead them with different classes in elementary and middle school. And we'd love to get a high school partner too, but I haven't done that yet.
Yeah, summer youth employment has been a way that Swale has worked with partners. So Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice is one of our main partners in the Bronx, and through that collaboration, we were able to work with 30 young people this summer who actually were the docents and gave tours of Swale, so they had to know everything that was going on and share with everyone else. And I guess on Swale specifically, we have a couple of different workshops that we've been utilizing when school groups would like to come that have to do with cleaning water from the river in order to use that on plants, and seeing how the cycle of the water from the river cleaned, the soil's important, and the plants, and I guess the entire ecosystem, how it works together. We've pulled that apart into 3 sections, so there are these workshops that are available. But
for us at WE ACT, we have a environmental health and justice leadership training process. We started that process with our members as a way of cultivating leadership amongst our membership. But for the past 6 years or 6.5 years, we've had a partnership with a school in Washington Heights called the Washington Heights Expeditionary Learning School, WHEELS. And through that, we have trained a number of young people about various topics under environment and environmental health. And this coming year, we're going to add a module around energy and energy justice. And so that is our most direct and sustained working with youth. But like many others, we also use summer youth employment as a way of engaging young people in the work that we do, in organizing in our community, and then also developing policy responses to the challenges that confront our community as well. So we have them testify at City Hall hearings, engage them in the process of working with our members and our working groups of our membership in developing policy responses as well. So,
great.
To add one more thing, Uprose also organizes the annual Climate Justice Youth Summit, which brings about 400 different youth together in the summertime to discuss climate justice, and it's the largest gathering of youth of color.
All right. Oh, we've got a question over here. Great.
What are your thoughts on the way distribution of funding following Hurricane Sandy was handled by the city with regard to how it may have contributed to distribution or displacement of small businesses, low-income families, and then later gentrification? And do you think there's been a noticeable change in attitude since Hurricane Sandy and like in the years following on how it could be like better prepared for, and how there could be like more preparedness in neighborhoods that really need it?
So certainly, if we're talking about federal funds, I'll segment for quickly for a quick second here. So if we're talking about federal funds, I think that there has been a significant challenge in terms of getting federal funds expended, both distributed and expended. And so one of the things that I will call to people's attention is that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, was supposed to come up with about $3 billion in funding for public housing that was Superstorm Sandy affected. And the residents of public housing are still waiting for those funds to actually get completely, delivered, and the benefits of those funds coming to particular housing developments they haven't experienced that as yet. I particularly want to just focus, for example, on something that I think is really egregious. East River Houses is one of the public housing development where we've done door knocking, and some of our members come from there. And they were one of the most impacted public housing developments in northern Manhattan. Flooding, as I mentioned at the outset, and no gas, and really crazy conditions to be living under for months and months after Superstorm Sandy. They had some power outage issues, et cetera. So thankfully, East River Houses, which is on First Avenue at about 105th or 106th, somewhere there, got FEMA money. So they were designated as, okay, this group is okay. Wilson Houses, which is another public housing development, literally across the street, was also impacted by water, literally was not on the list for a designation for funding. And that kind of stuff is what I think we all need to be outraged by, because it doesn't make common sense, right? And people don't operate by regulatory this and regulatory that. They look at this building is right across the street from one that got funding versus one that didn't, and the impacts were, for the most part, quite similar. And so that's something just to flag for people. And then when it comes to the state funding around Superstorm Sandy, some of that, we have worked fairly well with the Cuomo administration on a number of different things, but I tend to, and we tend to call it as we see it, some of that has also been sort of slow to get to places or used in ways that might sort of create political advantage in some places or the other. And so you don't want people who have been on the front lines of these kinds of impacts to be waiting, right? You see this happening in Puerto Rico right now. this is the one time where it should be absolutely clear that politics needs to get set aside, and we need to do things in the most effective way to make sure that people can get the resources that they need in the aftermath of a crisis. And that has not always been the best.
We might have time for 2 more, 1 or 2 more. You got it? Okay.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. I'm an emergency planner for the City of New York, and I focus on community resiliency. So I wanted to ask you about, I think we, as the City of New York, has made some progress in making the disaster cycle a little bit more participatory with communities that are impacted. But what other guidance do you have on how we can engage organizations? And you spoke a little bit about the role of art and culture, but how can we get buy-in from organizations like houses of worship or social service providers who are often serving communities that would be most vulnerable to these disasters in wanting to actually work on emergency preparedness, especially when these organizations have limited resources and a limited bandwidth, yet a multitude of issues to prioritize and work on?
Yeah, I guess my initial reaction is what you just said, the resources. I think more support to get financial resources to community-based organizations to do this work is what will be most impactful. I think also thinking creatively about how to use limited resources as well, like hiring a community emergency planner to where sort of that person's role could be shared amongst community-based organizations if they don't have the funding and resources to create that position themselves, but still allowing them to collectively work together towards community resiliency.
I think you're absolutely right that the city's Office of Emergency Management has taken some pretty good strides forward, and there are some more things to come. We've worked with them in terms of policy pieces that I think will unfold in the next couple of months or into the new year, more aptly put. So things like, picking up on Janae's point, resources, yes, to community-based organizations. Professional expertise kinds of exchange programs. So, someone like yourself maybe being placed at a community-based organization for a defined period of time and creating that kind of rotation into communities, I think would do a couple of things for, pardon the pun, the ecosystem. It would help the organizations gain capacity that they don't have the ability to fund at this particular point. It would help the communities that they work with sort of gain the knowledge that they need in terms of better emergency planning. And it would help the planner, someone like yourself, hear more about the expertise that resides in communities that can then be brought back into government that helps sort of inform. And so that kind of ecosystem feeding itself with information from the ground up and then from the government down, et cetera, or government sideways. I don't like government down because government is not above me, right? They're either working with me or for me. And so that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that, and this is, I have to be careful because this is stuff that's in the works now, so I don't want to let the cat out of the bag. You know how folks are when they want to be able to, bring out a big show and make a big announcement that they've done something. But I'll put it this way. I think that some of the stuff that will come, I think will also look at other areas in terms of emergency planning. So heat is a huge issue in terms of how climate affects people in this city. And we don't do enough. But there are things that are going to be coming if everything goes as planned and things roll out the way that, at least for the conversations that we've been engaged with the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, with. And I want to give kudos to some of the things that are coming. So the idea of really connecting around heat and protecting our communities from heat is something that you should be hearing about more in the future. And I think that is also part of our emergency planning as well. So expanding for people the sense that emergency planning isn't just about the aftermath of, like a flooding event or a Superstorm Sandy type event, but the types of days where we have prolonged sort of heat exposure and the vulnerability that creates, how we create partnerships between city government and local community-based organizations that are trusted, in their communities, I think will be something that we can look forward to in the future that on the other end we'll be applauding the city for. So keep your eyes peeled for that as well.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Go for it.
Hi, I have a question for everyone. In terms of scientists and working with, just in terms of like environmental justice, I feel like sometimes there's a divide between people who are working in more of an activist capacity and people who are working more in a scientific capacity. And I was wondering if you could speak to kind of your role within that dissection in the community.
I think that for me, projects like Swale and the people who are working on Swale, it's really about bridge building, and it's being in between, and it's about what was said earlier about de-siloing, and it is trying to be at the same time it's trying to be used as a space where we can collect information about what people might want in parks in order to think about both resiliency and food access, but it's also looking at how we can relay messages that are more scientific and how we can be a voice for potential policy change, right? So it's trying to play at the space in between, and it's very abstract in that way, I think.
So I am both a scientist and an activist, so I can speak a little bit to this, but I feel like the tension comes from sort of the top-down approach of science. So for us in the community space, it's really important to really acknowledge indigenous knowledge and the inherent knowledge that people have in themselves from their lived experiences. So things like participatory action research, where someone with technical expertise is actually starting their research question, coming out from the community and having them guide the parameters of what the question will be, what methods to use, how to engage other people in that. Is one way to sort of make, I guess, scientific research more equitable and to really give people an opportunity to really let you know what it is that they need researched in their community. So, yeah, things like that.
I would just say that for more than 2 decades now, we've had research relationships with Columbia, Mount Sinai right down the block from here, Pittsburgh, you name it, Hunter College. So for us, just as Janae said, there's no divide for us. As organizers, you want to bring resources to people so that they can solve problems. Scientists have resources and knowledge about things to help solve problems. I think the problem has been that the community-based participatory research approach that Janae lifted up has not been embedded properly in the canon of how science is taught. And so people understand, many scientists understand their role to be, in a tower, producing knowledge that does not get yoked to what communities need. And I use that word yoked very intentionally. If you're producing science that does not help advance people on the ground in the communities in which they're living from the problems that they're experiencing on a daily basis, then that's not the kind of science that we're interested in. If, however, you are prepared to operate in an ecosystem where science is one part of the knowledge, community expertise is one part of the knowledge, then we're happy to build solutions to the problems that we see in the communities that we organize in. All the time, every time, but that's got to be the paradigm. And until we get enough scientists operating under that paradigm and not operating on the paradigm that they have some superior knowledge to folks in the communities, or that they can tell people, or that they don't need to share results with people, or that their work is only about publishing to help advance tenure, that's going to be a problem.
Well, everyone, please give a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. This has been great. And thank you all for coming. This has been really wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you again.